Much talk about this, and rightfully so, about this stained glass window in the boss room of Sarkareth, the final boss of the new raid, Abberus. And it's really interesting. You gotta remember the context in which this is found, okay? Because a lot of people aren't taking the context into account. So at this point, we have fought the Echo of Neltharion, and we've seen the story of Abberus kind of tell us in many ways the story of the fall of Neltharion. So we've seen like lots of kind of Earthwater stuff kind of gradually become Deathwing stuff, and then kind of go into more voidy stuff, right? So people have very, very reasonably concluded, looking at this stained glass window, that it is Deathwing. And you can see why, right? You can absolutely see why this might be Deathwing. I think there's a better one, actually, in a more recent Wowhead article. I think they've kind of they've done a little article about it as well. So here's a better picture of the window, right? For a bit more context, okay? And people have very reasonably said that this is a stained glass window that presumably Deathwing made of himself. And let's get a picture of Deathwing to compare, because there's one very obvious reason why this would be Deathwing. So here's Deathwing. Here's our picture. Not hard to see why people would think this is Deathwing, right? The main thing is like the jaw here, this lower jaw, which looks like a stylized version of Deathwing's like steel jaw, right? Or his adamanthian jaw. So I can totally see that. I absolutely can. His eyes are the wrong color, but whatever, man. It's a purple window. Who cares? You've got this thing up here in between his horns. He's got his two horns here. If this is being Deathwing, you've got your two horns, which aren't as wide as they should be, but it's in a stained glass window, so whatever, it's stylized. And he's got a horn in the middle here, which you could quite happily read this diamond-shaped thing as being. Okay? So I can absolutely see why people would think this is Deathwing. It might be. You know, I don't fucking know what it is. I don't know what it is at all. But I don't think it is Deathwing. And I will tell you for why. Partly, it's because of the context in which this window is found. Now, like, it could be Deathwing. Let's assume it is Deathwing for a second. It is a nice cap for this story, where you've seen kind of the progress of Neltharion turn into Deathwing throughout the course of building this entire structure and this entire raid. So what better way to finish the raid than with, not only has he turned into Deathwing, but he's like, you know, building a monument to himself as Deathwing. Perfect. Really, really good. I get it. I still don't think it's Deathwing. And I'll tell you why. It's because this room is an old god prison, quite simply. So I'm not sure if Wowhead have a picture of it here, but this room, where this window is found, is underneath the main platform of the raid. And, oh, you can just about see it here. Leading down to the platform where this window is found are broken chains, the like of which would hold an old god. There was an old god in here that has got away. Simple as that. A Balrog. Yeah, exactly. You know, and these are chains that look exactly like the chains that held N'Zoth, and they've been broken. There was an old god here that has escaped. Okay? Why would there be a stained glass window of Deathwing by an old god? Counterpoint. This window does not look like Deathwing. Deathwing looks like this old god. Deathwing modeled his look on the old god that was underneath the building that he was building. As Deathwing got corrupted by this old god as he dug deeper under the ground of the Obsidian Citadel, it was the whispers of this specific old god that eventually turned him. And when he became Deathwing and started looking like Deathwing, why would he not look like that old god? Why, you know, would he not be like, I want to look like my master? Wasn't it established that N'Zoth corrupted him? No, not really. Rathian thinks it was N'Zoth, but that doesn't establish it in canon. all of the clues point towards it being N'Zoth, and Rathian thinks it was N'Zoth, and therefore we kind of think it's N'Zoth, and we've always kind of assumed it was N'Zoth, but it being a different old god that we didn't know about wouldn't break the law. It wouldn't be a retcon. It would just be like, oh, these characters were wrong. So yeah, my counterpoint to the argument that this stained glass window looks like Deathwing, because I agree with you. There are lots of things which do look a bit like Deathwing in this stained glass window, not least of all the jaw here at the bottom. I agree. This stained glass window does look like Deathwing. My counterpoint would be, I think Deathwing looks like the old god. And I think it looks more like Y'Shaarj than it does Deathwing, yeah. Should we look at... I think that my first reaction when I saw this window was that it looks like Y'Shaarj. Galakron would be another good shout, yeah. So for me, like, you know, this eye up here, these eyes to the side here, even this jaw, let's have a look, hang on. So if you think it looks like Deathwing, I don't disagree with you. My counterpoint is that Deathwing looks like the old god in question. So here's like the classic image of Y'Shaarj, like the main canon image. Canon is a loose term when you're talking about Hearthstone art, but the Hearthstone N'Zoth art turned out to be exactly what they based the in-game N'Zoth on. It wouldn't be crazy to imagine that they do the same with Y'Shaarj. So this eye here matches this eye here. Big Dark Moon Fair Eye. The horns, again, I mean, they match just as much as Deathwing's horns. The many eyes to the side we have. I would argue the jaw is very similar. The bottom jaw matches. You know, it's stylized, but it is what it is. For me, it matches Y'Shaarj much more than it matches Deathwing. Even to the extent of like this opening at the top of his head kind of matches this, in my opinion. Like the way that I say horns here, but actually this could be the opening of his head at the top. It could be a mix of the two. Like I say, you know, Deathwing kind of modeled himself on this. Or it could be a completely new old god. Or it could be Y'Shaarj, and, you know, like, obviously I don't think Y'Shaarj was actually imprisoned in this old god prison. I think it was a different old god. I think this is a new old god that was imprisoned there, personally. But that doesn't mean that this isn't Y'Shaarj, by the way. Because there are stained glass windows of other old gods in Yogg-Saron's room in Ulduar, right? A new old god or an old new god. Okay, so yeah, for clarification's sake, when I say new old god, I mean new in the sense that we didn't know about them before, but they would have been there for just as long as all the other old gods, yeah. Maybe this window's prophecy depicting the end boss being taken over by the Void, and it was a vision shown to Neltharion. Yeah, it could be that as well. But what I'm saying is I don't actually think it is... I just don't think it's Deathwing, honestly. I think it just... The teeth on the upper jaw here, the more mandible-y type teeth, I just think it looks more like Y'Shaarj than it does Deathwing, honestly. And even if it does look like Deathwing, which it does in some ways, I'll give it that. You know, if there was an old god under there, and if this was an old god prison, and Neltharion went mad and got corrupted by old gods, it's fairly reasonable to conclude that it was probably the old god who was in this prison, literally where he was building his hideout, where he wasn't corrupted when he started building his hideout, but he was corrupted by the time he finished building his hideout. I think it's fairly reasonable to conclude that it was this old god who was imprisoned here that corrupted him. Would you agree with that? Isn't Abberus a research place, not a prison? I'm not saying that Neltharion built the prison. I'm saying he maybe unwittingly built his research facility on a prison. And then as he got corrupted, he built further into where he then knew the prison was. That's a retcon? No, I don't think it is. I don't think it is a retcon, no. I thought the Titans only imprisoned old gods after they killed Y'Shaarj. Yes, exactly. Which is why I don't think it's Y'Shaarj. I don't think it is Y'Shaarj that was here. Like I say, even if this is a window depicting Yashiraj, and it doesn't have to be. It could be an old god we don't know that is a bit like Yashiraj in some ways. Even if this is a window depicting Yashiraj, that doesn't mean it was Yashiraj who was imprisoned there. I don't think it was, just based on what we know. Because you're right, no old gods were imprisoned until Yashiraj was killed. Although we know that some parts of him did survive and did retain power, like his heart, for example. We still don't know what happened to his head. Oh, what does this window depict? That seems like a cop-out. Oops, old gods were here all along, like oops, all the jailer. Really? You think so? You think introducing a new old god that was there is a cop-out? Was revealing the Zoth a cop-out? There was an old god in, Cthulhu, and then they were like, oh, actually, there's loads of these. Was that a cop-out? What if they didn't imprison an old god, but something from one of the other cosmic forces? I feel like we have to have license to add to the lore. And I would agree with you that, for many people, and for me as well, the whole jailer thing changed too much. I would agree with that. But I would think that some stuff, I also think that some stuff that people call a retcon with the jailer isn't actually a retcon. I think some is, and I'm with you on that. But I think some things are just really clever and worthwhile expansions of the lore, honestly. And I would definitely class, if this is the case, if this is a new old god, which is under the the Dragon Isles, I would absolutely class that as an expansion of the lore rather than a retcon. So what lore does it change? If it's a retcon, what does it change? Would be my question. I don't think it's a big of a deal when for a decade we thought it was 5 old gods, then the recent retcon to 4. Well, exactly. All this is doing is going by the original book that was in vanilla. The vanilla book says that they imprisoned 5 old gods. So if anything, this is restoring the lore. Because the original book that was in vanilla said that they imprisoned 5 old gods, and then the lore kind of was like, oh yeah, and by the way, before any old gods were imprisoned, Yashiraj was ripped out of the earth and killed, and then they imprisoned the old gods, all 4 of them. So that was the retcon, if anything. What this does actually restores the old lore. It undoes the retcon, I would argue. I would say this is the opposite of a retcon. It's actually making a part of the lore which, looks like a mistake. It makes something that looks like a retcon actually make sense. It's an unretcon. It's a retlib. Oh, that was bad. I'm sorry. For argument's sake, what about Mantid Queen? They descended of the Achaea, which are from the old gods. Yeah, exactly. Could be that too. I don't see why there would be a huge Mantid Queen down there, but could be. Have we heard anything regarding Xal'atath of late? Now, I don't think Xal'atath is an old god. I think she's like a being from the void, which would actually place her way above old gods in terms of power and importance in the void. But we don't know that. She could be an old god. I just don't think she is. That's not the impression I get from her. She's not very old goddy, is she? Yeah, she's I always see her as like a void princess on like a gap year. I don't think it's Xal'atath. Maybe it is, man. Maybe this is... It would be bad luck for Xal'atath to have been imprisoned under the Obsidian Citadel in Abberus, and then to escape presumably when... Okay, so... There are 2 possibilities as to why there is an old god prison in Abberus with no old god in it, okay? The most obvious one is, in terms of a timeline, is that when Deathwing got corrupted by probably this old god, he released this old god, right? That would be the most probable timeline. That's the one I think we would all assume. But there is another possible timeline. The other possible timeline is that this old god is imprisoned here until the Sarkareth fight. And it's Sarkareth that releases this old god. And that these chains have only just been broken. And that there's a cinematic just before the Sarkareth fight where we see this old god escape. which would actually make more sense from a why have we never heard of this released old god before? Similar to the incarnates being released in the vault, yeah, but like before the last fight as opposed to after the last fight. Third option, the being in question here was in fact Xal'atath, and she was imprisoned. She is an old god, or, you know, the Titans thought she was an old god, imprisoned her under here. For some reason, didn't fucking tell Neltharion. He got corrupted, released Xal'atath, and then she somehow managed to get herself trapped in the dagger later on. Which would suck. You gotta feel for her in that case, really. You gotta feel for her. You really gotta feel for her. Sarkareth is another Garrosh, mistakenly seeing the sins of his father as something to emulate. Yeah, maybe. Maybe. And also getting involved with voidy stuff like Garrosh did in the end as well. Yeah. But I mean, ain't that the story of the human race, really? You know, I'm fine. I'm fine with people constantly falling for the old gods, because that's something that's supposed to happen, right? I don't find that as like a retread. I don't really see, like, yeah, when you put it in, when you say it like that, it sounds pretty similar to Garrosh, but I don't think anyone would say it's actually similar to Garrosh. I don't think many people would say that the story arc of Sarkareth and Garrosh are actually that similar. When you put it like that, yeah, I think that's a nice kind of noticing of similar kind of themes in their character, for sure. But I don't think many people would really suggest that it's a retread. But I do like that you've noticed those themes. I think that's pretty cool. So I don't know. I'm not making any predictions here. I'm just giving you some options. I feel like, yeah, I don't think that is what happens, by the way. I don't think there is a cinematic before the Sarkareth fight where an old god is released, but it would explain why we suddenly end up in the void. It would explain why this room is all smashed up and Sarkareth is there, getting empowered by the void. It would explain why we've never really heard of this old god that escaped, because, you know, surely they should be out there causing shit if they escaped thousands of years ago, tens of thousands of years ago. What about the my people will survive part? The Sarkareth doesn't really say, you know, that's not really what... Sarkareth, it's more about Sarkareth and his people for him. I just don't think they're that similar, to be honest, no. Beyond, like, you know, wanting power. Old God was inside Deathwing, that's why he needed armor not to crumble. Then we killed him in the Maelstrom, which is Wound Crater, and that would mean Old God is inside Azeroth. Oh, that is true. That is true. Yeah. Definitely. I just think that there's an important difference in Garrosh and Sarkareth, just from the, like, apart from all the other very obvious differences. Like, Garrosh is a leader of a faction, you know? Sarkareth is the leader of a small band of rebels. Like, the whole power dynamic is very, very different. Garrosh was in charge of a faction that players were a part of, which was kind of the whole dynamic. You know, it's like he was a leader. He wasn't just a leader. He was a leader that you, the character, followed. He was your leader. Sarkareth is not, you know, like, Sarkareth is like, he's got a few mates. And like, that's a huge difference in like the dynamic and the effect they have on the narrative and the game and like their purpose in the narrative, I feel. Well, I mean, like, you're entitled to think differently. I think it is like a noticeable parallel in their kind of motivation, though, for sure. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. He is not a rebellion. He's with his own small faction. Okay, but I was using the term rebellion to kind of like conjure an image, right? Like, you can, yeah, sure, man, if you want to play semantics, but my point is they're a scrappy little band as opposed to he is someone in charge of an established faction that has existed for years and years and that he inherited and that he's using as a weapon. Like, Garrosh inherited the Horde and used it as a weapon to achieve a thing. Sarkareth has inherited nothing. He's trying to get to his inheritance. So, you know, that's like, I feel like the difference is pretty obvious. Like, Garrosh came into power and used that power. Sarkareth is seeking power, which he does not currently have. It's a huge difference. I mean, like, it's massive. Just because they both got daddy issues doesn't, like, yeah. Who hasn't, man? Like, who hasn't? My kids definitely have. You know? I feel like that's important. It's a very important difference. Anyway, there was definitely an old god down here, in my opinion. Or something old god adjacent, for sure. Something void adjacent. If you haven't watched my video on this, I highly recommend that you do. It's also quite likely that it wasn't actually an old god, but like something, a Void Lord, honestly. That would explain why, since they escaped, they haven't been causing any shit. Could well be a fucking Void Lord that was down here. And that's why they've like essentially turned this into a huge portal to the Void so they could get back home. I would say that's pretty likely, honestly. I'd say it's pretty likely there was a Void entity that wasn't an old god down here. And that's why they broke reality, because they just wanted to get home. You know, an old god gets free, and they're like, awesome, let's get down to fucking corrupting this world. But a Void Lord gets free, and they're like, fuck, I'm going home. And, you know, aren't they far too powerful? Well, I mean, you know, you could always make a weakened Void Lord or whatever, you know. Like drilling a tap into a big container of water, and then the water pressure is too much, the tap breaks open. Yeah, exactly. Did Shadow Flame come from the Void? I mean, technically, yes. Because it's made by a combination of a flame elemental and a shadow elemental. And, you know, shadow elementals have some connection to the Void, for sure. So there's an element of that, yeah. Yeah, I feel like the Void Lord encounters we've had aren't really canon. You know, the beings that we think are Void Lords that we have encountered, I don't think we really have. It is much more cosmic void in appearance than the old god corruption, yeah. And like I say, if you haven't watched my video on this, please do, because this is something that I talk about at the end of this video, about how, you know, we're looking for old god hints in all of this stuff, but I feel like we might be thinking a bit too small. I feel like we might be aiming our sights a bit too low when we're looking for old god stuff, because it certainly looks like maybe this raid is moving us into the territory of the Void and the Void Lords, and like, you know, going, well, old gods were one thing, but holy shit, man, you ain't seen nothing yet.